How do you measure type? Type is measured using points. So the point size of type refers to that entire process of metal type, the body size, not just the letter, and then there's some extra space in there to accommodate upper and lowercase letters and to prevent adjacent letters from touching each other. We know that when we add extra space in between lines, it was called leading because it was these strips of these strips of lead that were placed down on the letterpress. And the strips were called leading, and we use this term today. Two ways to measure type's point size. With one line of type, you measure from the top of the ascender to the bottom of the descender. This will obviously be imperfect because you don't know what the space between the type is. With multiple lines of type, it's a little easier. You can measure from the baseline of one line of type to the baseline of the next, but it is pretty difficult to measure the size of type once it's printed. It was meant to be a measurement for the physical blocks, the wood and metal blocks. When it's printed, it's a little bit different. There are these special rulers you can use, the Shadler ruler or Haber ruler, and they're a lot more accurate than just a normal ruler that you might have. So this is kind of how it translates. If you have type that has a point size of 35 and there's 13 points of leading, we measure that as 35 plus 13 equals 48. So that would be 35 type point size, 48 for the leading, 35, 48. Auto leading on the computer is 2 points. And so that would be 10 point type plus 2 points of leading, 10, 12. There's also these measurements called EMs and EINs. EM is a unit of measurement, always a square unit in height and width to the point size of a given typeface. Whereas EIN is a unit of measurement, always 1/2 the width of the EM. And to make things even more confusing, we have these things called picas. So we have points, but how do they translate into inches? 12 points equals 1 pica. 6 picas equals 1 inch. So 1 inch equals 72 points. And that's kind of how you think about it. With those specialized rulers, they're going to have the picas, the points, and the inches. And why don't we just measure in points? Because the points are so small, sometimes they can even be hard to see and distinguish between them. So picas are much easier to see, and there's only 6 of them per inch, whereas points, it's just harder to measure that way. So it's much easier to measure in picas and then times it by 12. And these are those rulers I was talking about, the Shadler or Haber ruler, and how they measure the point size. You measure from the top of the ascender to the bottom of the descender. And like I said, it's very hard to measure type once it's printed. And you can measure rulers, points, and picas with these rulers, and they're very accurate. Line length is measured in either inches or picas, and type is always measured in points. So when you're measuring the line of type, you measure from the edge of the first cross stroke. So that would be, sorry, let me go back to where I was. You measure from the edge of the first cross stroke, this T right here, to the very edge of that serif on the D. And that would be how you're going to think about it in terms of the line length. When you're measuring in points, you're going to measure from the top of the ascender to the bottom of the descender. And then you measure it in picas and multiply it by 12 because points are too hard to count. So 12 points of type equals 14 points of line spacing, and it's pronounced 12 on 14. So you can see how much of a difference leading makes. If you look at the first column, it's 9 by 9 Garamond. The second column is 9 by 10.8 Garamond. The third is 9 by 11, and the fourth is 9 by 13. And if your leading is too large or too open, it can be difficult to read. It reads more as lines rather than a block. And if your leading is too tight, it's really hard to read. So there's sort of this intermediate place you want to get to where it's not too tight or not too loose so that you have optimal legibility. Tracking loosens or tightens the selection of text. And kerning adjusts the space between just two letters or two characters. So there's tight tracking, and there's normal tracking, and there's loose tracking. You can kind of see here this example. So in Illustrator, like when you select a word or sentence and you're tracking it, you'll see that there might be little issues of space between the letters that need to be fixed, or else you need to have it fit specifically inside of a text block. And so this is an example of no tracking. This is a little bit negative, -5, and this is more intense tracking, -10. Kerning, you can see that these two letters here have been kerned and they're much tighter together. So kerning and tracking are something that you always want to do as a designer. You want to look, you want to analyze, you want to make sure it is kerned and tracked optimally. Often it's not, and you have to go in and manually track and kern in your software. So you can see Diablo Valley College. This is manual tracking and kerning being used here. So this week, you're going to be working on this project called Design a Word, and you really can express the meaning of a word or an idea through spacing and sizing and placement of the letters on the page. And I'm really hoping that you experiment with kerning and tracking in your designs. Sometimes it can be saying something when you track or kern letters together too tight, and sometimes it can have a message when you track them loose. So think about that. Or you can move a letter a little bit this way or that way, and it means something. So you really want to analyze and think about how you can do this project by manipulating the relationship and the spaces between the letters. Here's some other examples I'm going to show you. Compression and expansion. And you see with this compression, it's really loose at the beginning and really tight at the end. So that's something you can also think about. Migration, elimination, repetition. This is an example of really loose tracking and kerning where it's almost hard to read this statement. I hope you enjoy this experience. So when you have really loose tracking and kerning, you usually read it a lot more slowly. And this is a good contrast between the word embarrassed and the word aggressive. I'll show you a few more examples. Dieting, echo, hiccup. So you're going to have these words that you're going to have to express the meaning of the words in the way that you lay them out. And you want to use a basic sans serif font, no filters, no funky typefaces, 1 per page, 4 final compositions. One of those compositions manipulated by hand. So take a look at the assignment and just let me know if you have any questions.